I had been weighing two horn buttons in my palm, one slightly darker than the other, when the girl's shadow crossed the glass countertop. The light caught her braid first, loose in places where hair had escaped before her voice reached me. "You're the groom's mother, aren't you? Evan Grant?" The buttons pressed into my skin, the edges sharper than they had felt a moment before. "I saw him yesterday," she continued, "at Whitmore's. He was trying on this beautiful navy suit. Looked like it was made for him." One button slid from my fingers, rolled until it stopped against the spine of a swatch book. I didn't move to pick it up. "They've scheduled several fittings for him," she added. "It's very exclusive there." I pressed the envelope of buttons flat, as if that might keep something from spilling out. She lingered long enough for me to look up. Her expression was polite, the kind used when delivering good news. Then she moved toward the bolts of cotton at the far wall. I finished the purchase with the shopkeeper, the buttons sealed in a thin paper envelope. My list still had fabric tape and lining silk unchecked, but I folded it into my coat pocket. Main Street's brick facades looked the same as always. Across the street, Whitmore's window glowed under a striped awning, the kind that made everything behind the glass appear staged. Through it, I saw him, shoulders squared, hands resting easily at his sides. Vivian stood to his left, her fingers curled loosely around a measuring tape, as if it were an ornament. Clara stood close, tilting her head as she adjusted the knot of his tie, a narrow band of Italian silk, in a shade I wouldn't have chosen. He smiled at her reflection. The tailor stepped in, smoothing the lapel with two quick brushes of the hand. Vivian said something. His smile deepened. The jacket's line was different from mine, nipped tighter at the waist, shoulders sculpted to a point. Darker navy than any wool in my sewing room. Under the lights, the stitching was invisible, the way machines prefer it. I thought of the one at home. 5 months of chalk marks dusted away, basted seams pulled and redone, pressed open under the heavy iron until the cloth obeyed. I had chosen horn buttons for it this morning, each drilled smooth, each slightly unique in tone. No one in that room looked toward the street. I stepped away from the window, the image of his smile still caught in the glass behind me. At the corner, the signal light flicked red to white. I crossed slowly, keeping the paper envelope pressed between my fingers. A delivery truck rumbled by, carrying crates stamped with names I didn't recognize. The suit I had made waited on the dress form in the room where the late afternoon sun fell in sharp rectangles. The lining was still open, where I had checked the inside seams. The pocket welts lay flat, each corner bar-tacked by hand. On the inside, gray thread spelled his initials, small enough to go unnoticed by anyone but him. My husband taught me that a detail only the wearer knows. The crosswalk ended, and I stepped onto the opposite curb. At home, I set the envelope of buttons on the kitchen table beside a mug with yesterday's coffee stain at its rim. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the wardrobe I had opened, before leaving the same one where my husband's shears were wrapped in an old linen towel. I stood for a while with my hands on the back of the chair, looking at nothing in particular. The phone sat near the edge of the table. Calling him would be simple. Ask him directly, let him explain, but the thought closed over itself like a book I didn't want to reopen. Upstairs, the sewing room was as I'd left it. The jacket on the dress form seemed to wait, shoulders curved in the softer line my husband favored, the one that allowed movement without breaking the drape. The wool caught the light differently here, muted warmer. On the table lay the shears, the chalk pencil, the small glass jar that held extra needles. A loose thread dangled near the hem. I clipped it, the sound quick and final. I ran my hand down the front of the jacket. The cloth yielded under my palm in the way only hand-pressed wool can, the grain still true. Each buttonhole was finished with gimp cord inside tight enough to hold for decades. The paper envelope waited on the table's corner. I tipped it, letting the buttons roll into my palm again. Their weight felt unchanged. In the hallway, the phone lit once and dimmed. I walked past it. From the window, I could see the maple in the yard beginning to hold its leaves differently, the way it does before the air changes. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's screen door closed the sound faint but sure. The jacket would be ready to wrap once the buttons were on. I imagined folding it carefully into tissue, sliding it into the garment bag, carrying it to him. I imagined the pause before he reached for it, the polite thanks, the new navy suit already hanging in his closet. I set the buttons beside the shears. In the mirror across the room, the jacket's reflection was slightly distorted, as though the glass didn't want to hold it straight. I stood until my own reflection blurred into it. Downstairs, the refrigerator's motor hummed, then stopped. The quiet after was heavier than before. I stayed where I was, my hand resting lightly on the dress form's shoulder, feeling the give of the padding. Beneath the cloth, the steadiness of the stand beneath it. The phone lit again, then went dark. I let it. I kept the scrap of thread in the dish on my work table longer than necessary, as if it might remind me of the day I started. The fabric had arrived folded in brown paper, its weight more certain than the order forms I had stopped filling for the small online shop. I had told myself I'd return to shipping scarves and table runners later when this was finished. Later never came. The wool was charcoal with a faint twill ordered from a shop in Seattle that still wrapped yardage in tissue and tied it with string. I had set it out across the table, smoothing each length with my palms until the grain lay straight. "You know the camera will hate that color," Vivian had mentioned one afternoon in passing, lifting her glass without looking at me. I had nodded, adjusting the cuff of my sleeve, letting the comment settle like dust. The sleeves were cut for surgeon's cuffs, each buttonhole meant to open. My husband had shown me that once turning a jacket sleeve inside out to display the hidden precision. "It's for men who like to roll their sleeves back without wrinkling the line," he'd explained. The memory stayed in my hands, even when my mind moved elsewhere. "The light there is perfect for portraits," she had added, smiling as though the matter were settled. I set aside the photograph and wrote the deposit check without mentioning the numbers twice. The shoulder construction took 3 tries before I was satisfied. Most jackets in stores now sat stiff at the seam, the padding forcing a fixed line. I used a roping technique, layers shaped by hand, to give just enough rise at the sleeve head without the bulk. It let the cloth follow the body's shape, not resist it. Few people knew to ask for it anymore. "Feels old-fashioned," Evan had remarked in a tone meant to be casual, flipping through his phone while I pinned the side seam. "It lasts longer," I replied, though my voice was half lost to the hum of the iron. Each time I set the stitches, I thought of him standing still long enough for me to check the hem. In my mind, the light would fall in a way that made the fabric deepen in tone, the kind of light that didn't belong to a fitting room. The phone rang one morning as I was marking the vents. Clara's name lit the screen. I wiped my hands on the apron before answering. "Vivian thinks we should coordinate the groomsmen's ties with Evan's jacket. She says charcoal makes people look drawn." The tailor's chalk slipped slightly as I listened. I pressed it back into the seam line. "It's nearly finished." There was a pause. "We just want him to look his best." The chalk left a faint ridge where it had caught on the weave. I stored the jacket each night on the form, covering it with a cotton sheet. It wasn't to protect it from dust so much as to keep it separate, as though it were in a kind of quiet before being worn. When the buttons arrived, horn each one with its own slight shift of shade, I placed them in a shallow tin beside the shears. I imagined fastening them, the weight of the cloth balanced in my lap. The thread doubled and waxed so it would hold against years of use. In the evenings, I would fold back the lining to check the hidden stitches. The knots were small, tied close to the seam allowance the way my husband had shown me. Work meant to last beyond the season. At a Sunday dinner months earlier, Vivian had leaned across the table toward Evan. "We'll take you to Whitmore's for the final fitting. Their tailor knows exactly how to photograph a groom." Her eyes had passed over me as she spoke. I reached for my water glass, steadying it before lifting it to my mouth. The rim was cool against my lip, and I drank without hurry. Later that night, I stayed in the sewing room longer than I needed, adjusting the set of the lapel until it lay flat without pulling. The silence there was the kind that comes from work being nearly done. I thought about the photographs they would take at the lake, the easy smiles, the folded hands, the arrangement of bodies into symmetry. I imagined my jacket among them, holding its own in the frame without asking for notice. It was easier to picture that than to think of it staying behind. When I knotted the last thread on the hem, I slid the needle into the pincushion and smoothed the fabric one more time. The silver initials inside the pocket lay quiet, waiting for the hand that would know them. In my mind, he would reach for it on the day, slip his arm into the sleeve, and find the cloth ready, not because it was perfect, but because it was his. I left the room without turning off the light. I can still remember the feel of that linen under my fingertips, cool at first, then warming as I ran my palm along the grain. I had chosen it because it would soften with washing, the kind of fabric that could pass from closet to skin without the stiffness of newness. For his birthday, I folded the shirt with the seams inside, laid it in a plain white box, and taped the lid shut without adding paper or ribbon. The box sat at his place at the table, beside a glass of water that caught the glare from the kitchen light. He slid a finger under the tape, lifted the lid, and unfolded the shirt just enough to see the collar. "Nice," he said, eyes already shifting to Clara, who leaned in to fold it back and set it on the empty chair beside her. It appeared again weeks later. Sleeves rolled past the elbow. The fabric darkened with damp at the waist from where he had been filling the watering can. I watched from the porch as he bent to cut back the hedges, clippings gathering on his forearms, sticking to the weave. One evening at a long table crowded with plates and folded napkins, I mentioned the Veterans Project. I kept it brief, half a sentence about the jackets, half about the place they'd go. Vivian was aligning the salt and pepper shakers. Without looking up, she said, "That's fine. Just don't make a production out of it in front of people." Her bracelets made a dry sound against each other as she reached for her glass. I pressed the tines of my fork into a piece of bread until they left 4 small dots. There was a summer afternoon when I passed the patio, where Evan sat with 2 men I didn't know. The smell of charred meat hung in the air, the grill lid open beside them. "My mother's very skilled with her hands," he said, leaning back, one ankle crossed over his knee. The words came low, almost folded in on themselves, and the men nodded politely before the subject shifted to something else. From the doorway, I could see the glass of iced tea sweating onto the arm of his chair, leaving a pale ring on the wood. These things are small when they happen, slivers. You don't notice until the light catches them. Alone, they're easy to smooth over. Together, they form a seam that never sits quite flat, no matter how much you press. After Whitmore's window, after the navy wool and the silver tie, and the way his shoulders eased under the tailor's hand, I thought about how often I'd pressed those seams in my mind. I'd convinced myself it was better to keep the cloth together than to unpick it and find the fray beneath. At home, the charcoal jacket hung on its form in the sewing room. The stand is old. Robert made it from maple, sanding it smooth so fabric wouldn't catch. The shoulders held their line under the weight of the wool, the lapels resting the way I'd taught them to, without the pull you get from rushed work. The west-facing window was letting in a narrow strip of light. It caught on the edge, stitching the kind of fine work that disappears until a certain angle reveals it. The thread inside the pocket, silver and small, lay hidden but exact. I ran my knuckle along the seam from collar to hem. The fabric yielded slightly, not enough to crease, just enough to remind me it could move. The form didn't shift. Later that week, Clara stopped by to pick up a package she'd had delivered to my address. She stood in the doorway of the sewing room, her gaze moving from the iron to the jacket. "It's traditional," she said, as though trying the word for size. I kept the shears in my hand, the blades resting closed against my palm. She stepped back into the hall. "Anyway, thank you for holding the box." Her perfume lingered for a moment after she left something floral with a sharp end to it. The phone buzzed on the table that night. Evan's name lit the screen. I let it ring twice before picking up. "Clara thinks navy photographs better. The charcoal might look flat against the background." I could hear a television in the distance, the muffled rhythm of an audience laugh track. "It's almost finished," I said. "Well, we'll see. We just want it to look right." The call ended without the small formalities. I set the phone down beside the pincushion. The pins stood upright, their colored heads like a row of closed eyes. At the next family dinner, the talk turned to whether to travel to plans for the ceremony. Vivian poured wine into Evan's glass without asking the bottle, making a low glug before she tipped it upright. "You'll look handsome in whatever we put you in," she told him, and he laughed lightly, glancing down at his plate. The roasted carrots on my fork slid back onto the dish, leaving a faint streak of butter along the tines. That night, I unzipped the garment bag and eased the jacket free. The shoulders breathed a little once they were uncovered. I set it back on the form, stepped away, and let the light from the hallway fall across it. The grain ran straight from neck to hem, no twist, no bowing. The buttons still in their tin waited on the corner of the table, each one with its own subtle shift of tone. I stood with my arms at my sides, not reaching for the needle, not reaching for the buttons, just letting the weight of the wool hold its place in the room. It looked ready in the way a held breath is ready, poised, quiet, and unsure whether the signal would ever come. I kept my hands still. I had carried heavier things before, but never with this kind of weight. Not in the arms, there was nothing to strain the muscles, but in the quiet space between my palms and the fabric they held. The charcoal wool had been warm once under the iron alive, in a way only something handmade could be, now zipped away inside the garment bag. It felt like a sealed envelope I already knew wouldn't be opened. The hotel was built to impress in ways I never trusted. Hallways too wide, light fixtures that gave off a glow without warmth. Carpets that caught your steps so you couldn't hear yourself coming or going. I walked its length with the bag balanced on my forearm, fingertips resting on the zipper pull. Clara opened the door before I had a chance to knock twice. Her eyes flicked from the bag to my face, not lingering on either. One hand kept hold of her phone thumb, moving even as she stepped aside. Inside, the air smelled faintly of starch and flowers. Someone had been steaming suits, arranging centerpieces. Evan was at the far side of the room, standing near a window that overlooked the lake. The water behind him was bright enough to blur his outline. He was holding a navy jacket over one arm, its shoulders cut sharp and narrow. "I brought it," I said, setting the garment bag carefully on the back of a chair. He came closer, unzipping it part way. The silver lining caught the light, the words small and exact. "For Evan. From Mom." They'd taken an afternoon to stitch each letter slow enough to steady my breathing. His smile appeared in fragments, first polite, then uncertain, then gone. "It's maybe a little old-fashioned. Heavy, too. For outside, I mean." His fingers smoothed the lapel without looking at me, tracing the seam with the kind of inspection reserved for something bought, not made. From behind him, Clara's voice slipped in soft, but with the kind of precision that doesn't allow air between syllables. "We've already picked something else. Navy works better with the photo palette." She crossed to the closet and opened the door. The hanger inside held the other jacket pressed to a kind of perfection you could only buy. A silk tie in a pale shade of blue hung over it like an afterthought, staged for a magazine spread. Evan lifted my jacket from the chair and carried it toward the closet. His hands were careful, but not the way mine had been. His was a care of preservation, not of value. He hooked the hanger onto the far end of the rod, pushing it just past where the door's shadow would fall. "It's just for the ceremony, Mom. The other one's lighter." "More." He trailed off, closing the closet slowly. Fitting. The sound of the hanger sliding against the metal rod was brief, like a key turning only once before a lock gave way. I kept my hands still at my sides. There was nothing to rescue, no words that wouldn't tip forward and shatter on the floor between us. Clara looked at me only long enough to add, "We're on a tight schedule this afternoon. Fittings, photos, rehearsal, dinner. I'm sure you understand." The empty garment bag was folded in my lap before I realized I'd sat down to do it. I pressed the edges together, matching them until there was no gap, then ran the zipper all the way to the end. The small metal pull tapped once against the fabric when I let it go. Evan buttoned the navy jacket in front of the mirror. The cut was narrow, the shoulders straighter than his natural stance. Clara stepped up behind him, tugging the fabric at the waist, then smoothing it down. "There," she said, eyes on their reflection. "Now you look like the groom in the brochure." He laughed, quiet and quick. The bag felt almost weightless now, though my hands still curled around it, as if to keep it from falling. Evan glanced back at me over his shoulder. "The other one, maybe for another time." I let the pause stretch long enough to feel the air thicken, then answered with the only thing left that wouldn't break anything: "Up to you." No one replied. Clara turned back to her phone. Evan studied the mirror again, leaning closer, as though the glass might offer some final approval. I stood the folded bag tucked under my arm. The zipper pull caught on my sleeve for an instant before sliding free. The hallway outside was quiet, the carpet deep enough to hide the sound of the door closing behind me. By the time I reached the elevator, I couldn't hear voices anymore, only the steady whisper of air through the vents. Inside the bag was nothing but air, and still, it felt like I was carrying the absence of something I had once believed would belong. It is strange how an empty day can still feel crowded. Not with people, but with the weight of decisions that don't need to be spoken aloud. I woke that morning knowing I would not attend the wedding. No letter to explain, no call to excuse. Just a message sent to the family group, text, 3 words. "Not feeling well." I watched the little checkmark turn blue and left the phone face down on the table. The suit hung where I had placed it 2 nights before, still draped over the form that once belonged to my husband. The wood of the stand was darkened with years of oil from my hands, from his hands before me. Its shoulders had carried every project I was proud of. Now it carried something that no longer belonged to the person it was made for. The closet smelled faintly of cedar and chalk. I slid the suit from the form and laid it inside, folding the trousers over a wooden hanger, buttoning the jacket so the shape would hold. I slid it toward the back, next to the narrow box that held my husband's tailoring shears and the yellow measuring tape with the faded inch marks. Around mid-morning, a knock came at the door. A pause, then another, more a tap than a knock. When I opened it, the face was familiar in the way someone from a long-forgotten photograph might be. Marissa Doyle. She had been one of Evan's high school friends, the one with the easy laugh, the one who once spent an afternoon in my kitchen helping me cut fabric for a school play. She was older now, but the tilt of her smile hadn't changed. "I heard you weren't at the ceremony," she began, her eyes moving past me into the hallway. "I just wanted to check on you." I stepped aside and let her in. She saw the suitcase on the chair before I had time to think about moving it. Her gaze stayed on it longer than courtesy required. "Is that..." She began, then stopped as though the rest of the question might trespass somewhere private. "It is," I said. She moved toward it slow, like someone approaching a painting they've only ever read about. She touched the lapel with the back of her fingers. "This is hand-padded, and this lining, most people don't even attempt something like this anymore." It took some time, I told her. Marissa stepped back, looking at the garment as though measuring it in her mind. "Ben would wear this," she said finally. "Not just wear it, carry it the way it's meant to be carried. We're getting married next month and we've been searching for something. Well, not like everything else in the store windows." I stayed quiet. She glanced at me. "Would you consider selling it? I'd pay full custom rate. More if you—" I shook my head before she could finish. "It was made for someone specific. But if you want it, it's yours." "I can't take it for nothing," she insisted. "You can," I said, "and you will. Just promise me one thing. Don't change it. Let it be what it is." Her eyes softened in a way that was not pity, but recognition. She knew what it meant to give away something made with both hands and the quiet hours no one else sees. We carried the suit to her car together. The late morning air was mild, the kind that doesn't cling to you, but passes through. She placed the suit on the back seat, as if it were a living thing. When she closed the car door, she hesitated. "If you come to the wedding, you'll see it. On Ben. I think you'd like that." I only nodded. After she drove away, I went back inside. The space she'd occupied felt different, thinner somehow, as though her visit had folded a corner of the morning and tucked it away. I poured coffee into my husband's old mug, the one with the hairline crack down the handle. I sat at the kitchen table and traced the rim of the cup with my finger until the coffee went cold. The phone buzzed once on the counter. I didn't need to turn it over to know it was a photo from the reception. Clara's family in a cluster, Evan in his navy suit. Their smiles neat and presentable. I rinsed the mug in the sink, leaving it upside down on the towel to dry. Outside, the street was quiet, except for a boy riding past on a too-small bicycle, his knees lifting high with each turn of the pedal. He didn't look at the house, didn't see me through the window. In the afternoon, I opened the drawer of the sewing table and took out a spool of silver thread. I set it on the workbench without any fabric, without a needle. Just the thread. I let it sit there, catching the light when the sun moved across the floor. By evening, the house had settled into its usual rhythm, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock in the hallway, the faint creak of the roof when the temperature shifted. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't play music. The suit was gone, but the space it had occupied on the form still seemed outlined in the air like chalk on a board after the writing has been erased. I thought of Marissa lifting the lapel with the back of her hand, the way someone does when they understand the language of stitches. Some things don't need to be kept to be yours. Some garments seem to breathe differently when they find the right shoulders. I saw the photograph before I heard about the wedding. It was in the Sunday lifestyle section, tucked between an article on seasonal wines and a recipe for grilled peaches. A wide shot of a vineyard rose of green behind the wedding party, and there Ben, in the charcoal suit I had stitched in quiet months, the lapel holding its curve like it had always belonged there. The headline read, "Groom in handcrafted masterpiece turns heads at vineyard ceremony." I kept my eyes on the page longer than necessary, following the way the light caught the silver thread under the first button. I could almost feel the weight of the wool again, the slow give of the fabric when pressed beneath my fingers. The phone rang once and stopped. Then again, longer this time. I let the machine take it. The voice was unfamiliar, clipped, businesslike. "This is Helen from Bridal Seasons magazine. We'd love to feature your work." A pause, then the click of disconnection. By late afternoon, the article had moved online. Someone had tagged me on a local forum, my name in bold letters. the comment underneath. Finally, someone still knows how to make a real suit. The next morning, I opened my inbox to a row of subject lines. Custom commission inquiry. Urgent wedding in 3 months. Referral from Marissa Doyle. I scrolled without opening them, the names and dates blurring together until one caught my eye. Appointment request. Veterans Gala. The sender had attached a photo of a man in uniform, medals, heavy on his chest. Underneath, a single line. I want something worthy of the night. 3 weeks earlier, I had been standing in a hotel room, the suit still warm from the bag my son's hands, pushing it aside without meeting my eyes. Now it was in a vineyard, on another man's frame, in the center of a frame, viewed by strangers who thought it was worth looking at twice. I didn't go to the wedding, but Marissa sent me a message the next day. No greeting, just a photo. Ben laughing the sleeve, catching the sun, the silver lining flashing when the wind caught the hem. Underneath, she had written, "They asked where it came from. I told them." At the market that week, Mrs. Daly from 2 streets over stopped by my cart. She glanced at the stack of apples I was weighing. "Saw your work in the paper," she said, her voice low enough to make it sound like a confidence. "Didn't know you were still at it. Thought you'd slowed down." I wrapped the apples in brown paper, sliding them into her bag. "Some things don't need to be rushed," I said. Her mouth curved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. "Well, people pay for what's in style now. You might as well take advantage while it lasts." The line moved, and she was gone. By evening, 3 more calls had come in. One man left a message saying he'd drive 4 hours if it meant I could fit him for a suit in time for his daughter's graduation. Another asked if I did women's blazers. The last was a boutique owner wanting to collaborate on a signature line. I erased that one before it finished. The article itself was brief, no more than 2 paragraphs, but it lingered on the detail work hand-felled collar surgeon's cuffs, monogrammed lining. It named me plainly Taylor Thelma Grant. Not family friend, not local seamstress, just the name. I thought of my son reading it if he had. I imagined his expression settling somewhere between recognition and dismissal, the way he used to look when a teacher praised me for helping with costumes at school. 2 days later, Marissa called not to talk about the suit, but to tell me about the vineyard. They had these little lights strung between the rows. When the sun went down, it felt like walking through constellations. She paused, then added, "Ben didn't want to take the jacket off, said it felt like it was made for him." I listened without interrupting. "Some people kept asking if you take orders," she went on. "I told them you're selective." That word stayed with me after we hung up. Selective. Not unavailable, not retired, just choosing where the work goes. I walked into the sewing room, the one I hadn't touched much since the suit left. The table was bare except for a single chalk pencil worn down to half its length. I picked it up, rolled it between my fingers, and set it back in the same spot. A week after the article, a letter arrived, hand-delivered. Heavy cream envelope, my name written in ink that had bled slightly into the fibers. Inside was an order form from a men's club downtown, the kind my husband once belonged to. They wanted 6 jackets for their spring gala each with a unique lining. I folded the paper back into the envelope and left it on the mantel. The fire wasn't lit, but the scent of old ash lingered from the last cold night. In the quiet that followed, I realized no one in my family had called about the article. No message of acknowledgement, no passing mention. The suit had become something in the world, and yet in the rooms where my name should mean something, it was still just fabric. The vineyard photo was still clipped to the refrigerator door. I didn't put it there. Marissa must have left it during her visit, but I hadn't moved it. Each time I passed, my eyes went to the way the jacket settled along the line of Ben's back, the way the vent opened just enough when he stepped forward. I thought of the stitches inside the ones no one would ever see, the ones that held it together without announcing themselves. Some work I've learned belongs more to strangers than to blood. Some offers arrive dressed as kindness, but wear the weight of calculation in the seams. The first week after the article, I kept a notebook beside the phone. By Friday, the page was full names I didn't recognize, numbers with area codes from far away. A lawyer from Chicago wanting a 3-piece for a winter wedding. A pianist asking for something stage-worthy, but not flashy. A man whose only request was that the jacket carry a story no one else could claim. I started returning calls in the evenings, the hours when the light in the sewing room softened and the walls seemed to hold sound instead of releasing it. Some hung up when they heard the wait time. Others adjusted their dates without hesitation, as if the delay was part of the value. By the second month, I couldn't keep up alone. I called Rosemary Clark first. She had been let go from the tailor shop downtown years ago when the owner switched to outsourced alterations. She came by the next morning, her hands running along the edge of my cutting table like she was greeting an old friend. A week later, I brought in Donna Hayes, whose eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but whose hand stitching could coax a stubborn seam into submission. We worked in a quiet rhythm, 3 pairs of scissors clicking in different cadences. Sometimes, Rosemary hummed a hymn under her breath, low enough to blend with the sound of fabric shifting across the table. The shop came next. A corner space on Main, the kind of storefront that had housed everything from a bakery to a florist over the years. The floorboards had a faint tilt toward the street, and the front window framed the courthouse clock perfectly. I hung a wooden sign above the door, Grant & Company in handcrafted suits. Every month, the display changed a single suit on a headless form lit from above, so the fabric caught the shadows in a way that made people stop mid-step. One month, it was herringbone with horn buttons. The next, a midnight blue lined with cream silk. Customers left handprints on the glass when they leaned in to look closer. It was during one of those slow afternoons, the ones where the hum of the ceiling fan feels louder than it is that the bell over the door rang. Evan stepped inside wearing a jacket I'd never seen before. Slim-cut, machine-finished lapels, the kind of thing meant to photograph well under artificial light. He looked around like a man surveying a property he might buy. "Nice place," he said, his gaze on the walnut shelves. "You've done well for yourself." I was standing behind the counter trimming loose threads from a cuff. He picked up one of the sample books, flipped through the swatches like he was assessing assets. "I think we should talk about where this is headed. You've got a name now, and names can be leveraged." I set the cuff down, the scissors resting beside it. "You could expand. Open a second location in the city. I have contacts who could get you better rates on fabric. We could streamline production, find a manufacturer to handle the base work, leave you with the final touches." The word streamline sat in the air like a draft through a closed door. "You're charging too little," he went on. "Double your prices, and we'll still have a wait list. And if you let me manage the financial side, you won't have to worry about the business side at all." I looked at the shears on the counter, the finger loops polished smooth by years of use. "There's no reason not to grow," he said, his voice lighter now, as if we were on the same side of something. "Think about it more. Clients, more visibility, maybe even a feature in a national magazine. This is the moment to scale up, Mom." The clock in the courthouse struck 3. The sound came through the glass, thin but precise. He smiled in a way that folded the years between us into something unfamiliar. "I can help you make this bigger than you ever imagined." I thought of the first jacket I had ever made for him, the way he stood in front of the mirror tugging at the sleeves like he couldn't decide if they belonged to him. That jacket had ended up in the back of a closet under a garment bag never worn beyond our front door. The scissors were still on the counter. I slid them slightly, the metal whispering against the wood. "I'm not looking to make it bigger," I said, though my voice was quieter than his. He blinked like he hadn't considered that answer existed. "You're turning down growth. I'm turning down something I said." His jaw shifted, the faintest tightening, before he set the sample book back on the counter. You've always had a hard time seeing opportunity when it's right in front of you. I picked up the cuff again, brushing a stray thread from the fabric. Just think about it, he added, already walking toward the door. This kind of chance doesn't last forever. The bell rang as the door closed behind him. Rosemary, who had been stitching in the back, stepped into the doorway. Friend of yours, I kept my eyes on the needle in my hand. Family, I said. She nodded once and went back to her seat. I set the cuff aside and opened the bottom drawer of the counter. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a set of mother-of-pearl buttons I'd been saving for something that mattered. I ran my thumb over their surface, smooth and cool. Outside, the courthouse clock ticked toward the next hour. Some things are worth keeping at their size, no matter who notices. The work fills the days in a way nothing else ever has. Not because of the hours or the orders, but because every piece leaves with something of my hands still in it. By now, the calendar is closed 6 months ahead. I keep it that way, even when the calls come from people who say they'd fly across the country just for a fitting. The answer doesn't change. I don't want the shop to swell into something I can't feel under my fingertips. Each morning follows the same quiet order: grind the beans, fill the pot, and wait for that first thin curl of steam. I take the same chipped mug from the shelf, the one with the faint hairline crack near the handle, and pour without rushing. Before I unlock the door, I walk the floor, checking each suit on the rack. My hand pauses at any seam that doesn't lie exactly as it should. When I run a finger along a finished cuff, I know Rosemary has touched it. The way the stitches sit low and neat gives her away. Donna's work shows in the pockets tight, exact, never pulling at the edges. I don't tell them this. Some things are better left unsaid, the knowledge shared only by the cloth itself. It was on a Thursday that Evan appeared again, the bell over the door, breaking the rhythm of scissors and cloth. He stood just inside, holding his phone like a prop. You're still booked solid. His tone was half amazement, half calculation. I nodded, setting a measuring tape back in its drawer. You could triple your output with the right setup, he went on. Switch to blended fabrics. No one can tell the difference now. Cut your production time in half. I can handle the marketing, get you in front of the right people online. You double your prices without losing a single order. I leaned against the counter, letting the wood press into my palms. This isn't a line, I said after a pause. It's a bench, a table, a needle. Every suit leaves here with a name sewn into it. You can't do that by the 100. His laugh was soft, almost indulgent. You're romanticizing it, Mom. People just want something that looks good. They don't care if it's stitched in New York or Newark. I reached for my coffee, now gone lukewarm, and took a small sip. This isn't about where it's made, I said. It's about how. He slid his phone into his pocket, his expression tightening in that way I recognized from when he was a boy being told no. You don't have to keep it small just to prove something. I didn't answer. The sound of Donna's shears from the back room filled the space between us. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You could be sitting on the kind of money that changes lives. Do you really want to waste that? The word waste landed with the weight of a hand pushing something off a table. This is my life, I said, placing the mug down gently. His eyes moved to the display suit in the window, a charcoal with a faint overcheck. You know I've been talking to a friend who's in apparel manufacturing. If you let me connect you, we could... No, I cut in, not sharp, but flat. He let out a small exhale, shaking his head. You'll regret it when the orders slow down. I brushed a thread from the counter and let it fall to the floor. He turned for the door without another word, the bell giving its short, bright ring as it closed behind him. When the sound faded, I looked at the stack of invoices waiting for my signature. Each one carried a name, a date, and a set of measurements. I signed them in my usual black ink, the nib of the pen catching slightly on the paper, where the grain was rough. At lunch, Rosemary mentioned she'd seen Evan leave. "He still thinks you'll change your mind." "I think he hopes I will," I said, cutting into a roll of chalk. She nodded, her hands busy with the jacket on her lap. In the late afternoon, a man came in to pick up his order. He turned the jacket over in his hands, studying the stitching under the light. "It's rare," he murmured, not to me but to himself, to feel the work of a person, not a process. After he left, I stood for a moment in the empty shop, the hum of the fan in the ceiling settling into the quiet. I thought of Evan's words opportunity scale waste and how they sat so differently from the words I lived by grain drape ease. The sun slid low enough to cast a line of light across the floorboards, stopping just short of the counter. I watched it for a while, knowing it would shift, soon as everything does. Not all growth is meant to be taken. I have never believed in drawing lines with chalk. Chalk fades, smears, disappears in the first wash. Lines need thread pulled taut, locked into the fabric so they don't wander. Evan came earlier than usual, the door still cool from the night air. He walked past the front display without looking straight to the counter where the lease papers lay. "So you're really going to sign this?" His eyes moved over the pages like they belonged to him. "It's mine to sign. You don't have to make it so permanent. We could still—" "This is my shop," I told him, my voice steady enough that even I noticed. "I don't need anyone managing it for me. If you want to help, start by respecting how I do things." His jaw shifted, the words catching somewhere between his teeth. "You know I only want the best for you. The best for me is this," I said, tapping the contract lightly with the back of my hand. "Not more, not faster. Just this." He glanced toward the window as if the glass might offer him a way to undo what he'd just heard. "You're shutting me out. You're asking to come in with a wrecking ball." For a moment, his shoulders sank, but not from understanding, more like the weight of someone realizing they won't win. I turned the pages, pressing the pen into the first line where my name would live for the next 10 years. The tip bled a tiny dot of ink before the stroke found its way forward. When I finished the last curve of the final letter, I closed the folder and placed it at the center of the counter. "It's done." Evan's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked at me the way people do when they're trying to remember if they ever knew you at all. I reached under the counter for a stack of cream-colored cards I'd ordered a week ago. On each, I had already written a name in my smallest handwriting, the first dozen customers who had trusted me before any magazine thought I was worth printing. I slid one card out, read the name once more, then tucked it into an envelope with a simple line inside. "Thank you for believing in what was not yet visible." Evan watched as I did it again and again. "You're really sending notes to strangers instead of family." "They're not strangers," I said without looking up. "They made this possible. They didn't raise me." I set the pen down the point, resting against the lip of the inkwell. "No, they didn't." Silence held between us long enough for the tick of the wall clock to mark more than a minute. From the shelf above my sewing table, I took down a small wooden frame. Inside was a scrap of cloth wool, slate gray with a single button sewn on. The button was mother of pearl, a touch too large for the swatch, but I had left it that way. My husband had worn it once before the thread gave out. I'd kept it as it was, imperfect, but mine. I set the frame on the counter beside the lease. "This stays here," I told Evan. "It reminds me that every piece I make is worth holding on to, even if someone else thinks it belongs in a drawer." His gaze flicked from the frame to the contract, then to the door. "You've made up your mind. I made it up the day I put my name on the first hem." The doorbell chimed softly when he left, though the air in the shop barely shifted. I stood still, the absence of his shadow on the floor, longer than it should have been. I moved to the window display, straightened the lapel on the mannequin, and brushed away a strand of loose thread. Then from a drawer under the till, I took out a small placard I'd ordered, but not yet unwrapped. The paper crinkled as I pulled it free. Every stitch has a story, all by Thelma Grant. The letters were black, clean, carved into the grain of the wood, deep enough that no sanding could erase them. I held it there for a while, my fingers resting on the cool edge. Through the glass, the street moved as it always had, people passing, carrying bags, talking into their phones, not knowing or caring what it meant to claim something without asking permission. When I finally set the sign in place, the reflection in the window caught my own face. It wasn't the one Evan had tried to manage, or the one that had waited in the background at his wedding. It was simply mine. I went back to the cutting table, laid the shears on the cloth, and adjusted the edge until it sat straight. The steel met the wool with the quiet sound I'd known my whole life: 2 blades, 1 purpose, a line that would hold. And I kept cutting, as if each pass anchored me a little deeper into the work I'd already chosen. Sometimes I wonder if it's the quietest moments that matter most. Not the loud decisions, not the ones you announce to the world, but the ones where you choose the direction without a word. I'm still getting used to the rhythm of it. The shop has a pulse now, a steady one, like the second hand on an old clock, that never gets too fast or slow, but keeps moving just enough. There's a hum in the back, the soft scrape of the scissors, the quiet press of the iron, the small exhale of Rosemary as she bends over a hem. This is my life now, measured, steady, quiet. The suits go out one by one, each leaving with a name attached to the lining. It's strange to see how something so small, a stitch, a button, the curve of a pocket, can become a part of someone else's life so easily. I'm learning that now more than ever. The door opened again, the bell giving its usual jingle. A young man in his early 30s, a bit too eager in the way he shifted on his feet, entered with the same polite uncertainty that most new customers have. "I'm here for my fitting," he said, though I hadn't yet taken down his name. I nodded and gestured to the fitting room. "We'll get started." The jacket was hanging in its usual place. I had made it over the past week, stitching each seam with my usual focus, knowing it would fit him just right. The wool had been selected carefully, the lining chosen for its strength as much as its softness. When I handed it to him, the fabric caught the light in a way that I hadn't expected. I stepped back, watching his hands settle on the fabric. He slipped it on without a word, then stood in front of the mirror. For a long moment, he said nothing, just turned his shoulders once, twice, then looked back at me. "It fits perfectly. Just perfect." I smiled at him, though it didn't feel like much of a smile. Just a small curl at the corners of my mouth. "You're welcome. Now we just need to adjust the sleeves." As I pinned the cuff, I heard the door open again. This time it was Evan. He didn't need to announce himself. I could feel the change in the air, the slight shift in the room. He hadn't come in for a fitting or for a customer. He had simply come as he had before, as he had learned to do. He stood by the counter, hands in his pockets, watching us without a word. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet space between us. "Mom," he said eventually, his voice softer than it had been when he walked in. "I've been thinking about what we talked about the way things should be." I stopped pinning the cuff and turned to him. "You've been thinking?" "I've been thinking," he said, his mouth tightening. "I've been looking at how things are now, and I see it. I see how you've built something that's not about just selling a jacket, but about something real. Something that matters." I looked at him without answering, feeling the weight of the silence between us. The man in the jacket stepped back from the mirror, adjusting his sleeves without asking. I was wrong, Evan added quietly. I didn't see it before. What this really is. His voice was steady, but the words were heavier than they should have been. I didn't respond right away. It wasn't a question and it wasn't an apology. It simply was. The man finished his fitting a bit too eager to pay and leave, though I could tell he appreciated the work. As he left, he thanked me again and promised to come back, and I smiled politely. When the door clicked shut behind him, Evan remained where he stood, his hands still in his pockets. The air between us shifted, but I couldn't say how. He cleared his throat. You've built something good here, Mom. Something better than I thought possible. I know I didn't understand it, but I'm starting to see it now. Maybe I was wrong about how this should go. He took a step forward closer to me. I can help if you need it. I won't interfere anymore. I felt the weight of those words without responding, looking down at my hands. The scissors, which had been idle for a while, seemed to take on a presence all their own. The quiet hum of the shop, the sound of Evan's voice, faded to the background. I folded the measuring tape and placed it back on the shelf, then took a moment to think. Mom. I looked up at him. He seemed smaller, quieter, standing there with his hands at his sides. The man in the jacket was long gone, but his words stayed. I'm not here to change it, he said, as if sensing my hesitation. I'm here to learn. From you. I didn't speak at first, just folded the thread and tucked it into the drawer. The small snip of the scissors was sharper than the silence. When I turned back to him, I could see it, the subtle shift in the way he looked at me now. Not with the frustration or distance of the past, but with something that had taken longer than I thought to surface. I know what you've done here, Mom, he said softly. I'm proud of you. I nodded. The air felt different, lighter perhaps, but it was a new kind of quiet. Not the quiet of unfinished work, but the quiet that comes with understanding. He left not long after saying he would check on some of the orders coming in. I stood by the counter watching him go, and as I did, I realized something. This wasn't about the suit, the jacket, or even the work. It was about us, about the way things had been and the way they would be. There had been no grand apology, no dramatic reckoning, only small changes, the kind that settle into the bones over time. As I locked the door behind me that evening, the shop felt quieter than before, but not emptier. I reached for the framed photo from the previous year, the one of us. Evan and I standing together in front of the shop. His suit still new mine, carefully worn. I set it down beside the counter and ran my fingers over the glass. The store would be open again tomorrow, the same rhythm returning. But something had shifted. And it wasn't about what we had done, or even what we had left undone. It was about what we could still do together.